Apollonius of Tyana, a glimpse into his mystical life, Ralph Shirley. The difficulty of treating of such a subject as the life and activities of the philosopher of Tyana lies in the fact that the story of Apollonius's career has been overlaid with legends of the miraculous on the one hand and distorted by religious prejudices on the other. While the only authoritative account of this great religious reformer is marred by the glaring deficiencies of the writer for the task which he had in hand and his inability to appreciate the lifework of the subject of his biography. Indeed, he fills many pages with literary padding of the worst kind, while he fails to give us over and over again the very facts which it is of value and importance for us to know. Philostratus, the author of this life, was one of the literary coterie that gathered round the presiding genius of the Empress Julia Domna, the wife of Septimus Severus and mother of Caracalla. Julia Domna was a generous patroness of art and literature, and her husband Severus was devoted to the study of occult science. Gibbon, in his usual skeptical vein, observes that he was passionately addicted to the vain studies of magic and divination, deeply versed in the interpretation of dreams and omens, and perfectly acquainted with the science of judicial astrology. The empress, who was a daughter of the priest of the sun at Emesa in Syria, was an enthusiastic bibliophile and had collected, among her other literary treasures, the notebooks of Damis, the companion and fellow traveler of Apollonius. These notebooks or tablets contained the records of his journeys and other details concerning the life of Apollonius, who was as great a hero to Damis as ever Johnson was to Boswell. If these notes were as full of detail as Philostratus asserts, one can only regret that the biographer did not turn them to more useful account. Damis was a native of Ninus or Nineveh, and Philostratus speaks somewhat contemptuously of his defective Greek style. But it is probable that with all their grammatical errors, the notebooks of Damis would have given us a truer portrait of the great philosopher than the more finished phrases and elaborate oratorical devices of Philostratus. The biographer had also access to a book written by Maximus of Ægae, containing a record of Apollonius's doings at that place. It requires an acute critic to gauge how much of Philostratus's narrative is literary embellishment and interpolated matter, and how much is actually derived from the original records. Even the Gospels of the Evangelists hardly present a more difficult task to the critic anxious to discriminate between the original and the glosses with which it is overlaid. The other difficulty from which the record of Apollonius's life and teachings has suffered is due to the religious disputes which arose through the rapid growth of Christianity and its conflict with the previously existing religions of the Roman world. We may argue legitimately enough that the power of working miracles is no proof of the truth of the doctrines expounded by any religious teacher, but the fact remains that in proselytizing for Christianity, the fullest use was made of the miracles recorded as accomplished by Jesus in the Gospels, in support of the contention in favor of the divine origin of their worker and of his work. Illogical though this argument may appear to the philosophic mind, it is not surprising that it should have carried great weight, and indeed it must be admitted that it does so even at the present day. What more natural, then, than that one of the disputants on the other side should have produced a polemical pamphlet in which he attempted to show that such an argument was a two-edged weapon, and that in fact it was possible to produce better evidence in favor of the miracles attributed to the pagan philosopher Apollonius than for those of Jesus of Nazareth, and to argue that this being the case, even assuming the authenticity of the gospel narrative, there was no more justification for regarding the Jewish prophet as a god than the Tyanian philosopher. Such a criticism of the claims of the Christians was in fact written by Hierocles, a philosopher of some note and successively governor of Palmyra, Bithynia, and Alexandria, about the first decade of the 4th century AD, under the title of Philalethes, or the Truth Lover. This pamphlet was not long in provoking a rejoinder from a leading light of the Christian community. The reply, the author of which was Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea, is still extant, though Hierocles' contribution to the controversy was destroyed, like much other evidence hostile to Christianity, by the ecclesiastical authorities. when the new religion finally became triumphant. Eusebius was able to show that Philostratus was not a reliable authority, and that his judgment, where the credibility of a narrative was in question, was clearly at fault. Though the criticisms of Eusebius might have been applied with equal force to much of the Gospel record, it is plain that his retort to Hierocles did not lack point, the veracity of Philostratus being obviously not above suspicion, and some of his narratives urgently calling for evidential corroboration indeed, in certain cases being mere legend or romance. This applies in especial to the account given of Apollonius's journey to India, which is interspersed with numerous fantastic stories which appear to be derived by Philostratus from other sources and interpolated in an unscrupulous manner, with the idea, presumably, of giving local color. There are, however, numerous records given which are clearly taken direct from the narrative of Damis, and the general accuracy of which there appears to be no adequate reason to call in question. One of these offers a parallel to the various accounts of the raising of the dead to life given in the Gospel story. Would you like me to format the full clean text into a downloadable Word or PDF file with proper paragraphs and titles? Or keep it as plain text in this chat? I can continue cleaning and outputting the rest of the essay in full. You said, continue as plain text. ChatGPT said, certainly. Here's the continuation, with all page numbers and footnote markers removed, preserving every word, punctuation, and structure exactly as in the original. One of these offers a parallel to the various accounts of the raising of the dead to life given in the Gospel story, as, for instance, the recalling to life of the son of the widow of Nain, the raising from the dead of Jairus' daughter, and last but not least, the case of Martha and Mary's brother Lazarus, which, owing to the circumstances surrounding it, has caught hold of the popular imagination to a greater extent than either of the others. The record of the incident referred to is given in Philostratus's life as follows. Here, too, is a miracle which Apollonius worked. A girl had died just in the hour of her marriage, and the bridegroom was following her bier, lamenting, as was natural, his marriage left unfulfilled, and the whole of Rome was mourning with him, for the maiden belonged to a consular family. Apollonius, then witnessing their grief, said, "Put down the bier, for I will stay the tears that you are shedding for this maiden." And withal he asked what was her name. The crowd accordingly thought that he was about to deliver such an oration as is commonly delivered as much to grace the funeral as to stir up lamentation. But he did nothing of the kind, but merely touching her and whispering in secret some spell over her, at once woke up the maiden from her seeming death, and the girl spoke out loud and returned to her father's house, just as Alcestis did when she was brought back to life by Hercules. And the relations of the maiden wanted to present him with the sum of 150,000 sesterces, but he said that he would freely present the money to the young lady by way of dowry. Now, whether he detected some spark of life in her, which those who were nursing her had not noticed, for it is said that although it was raining at the time, a vapor went up from her face, or whether life was really extinct, and he restored it by the warmth of his touch, is a mysterious problem which neither I myself nor those who were present could decide. The record of this incident is presumably taken direct from the notes of Damis, and is not, I think, to be too lightly set aside. Apollonius does not appear to have made any claim to supernatural power in the matter, nor need he be necessarily credited with anything beyond an intuitive capacity for divining the fact that life had not finally departed. Nor indeed are we bound to assume anything more than this intuitive capacity as regards the two first mentioned miracles in the Gospel records, those of the son of the widow of Nain and Jairus' daughter. The raising of Lazarus may be held to stand in a different category, but it is noteworthy as regards this, that only one evangelist records the incident, and that his gospel is the latest in date of the four. This has naturally not escaped the attention of the critics, as it is almost incredible that neither Matthew, Mark, nor Luke should have alluded to so sensational an incident if they had any knowledge of its occurrence. On the other hand, So dramatic an event could hardly have failed to excite the greatest commotion at the time, and must, one would naturally have supposed, inevitably have reached the ears of those who were writing biographies of the performer of the miracle. The incident, in short, is hardly one that could be placed even on the same evidential plane as the raising of the consul's daughter at Rome by Apollonius. The problem as to whether life is or is not extinct in any specific instance has over and over again proved too difficult of solution for even the ablest of modern doctors, and in cases of trance, opinions of the medical profession can be freely cited that there is no apparent difference to be detected between the living and the dead. Numerous tests have been applied and failed in cases where the patient has eventually regained consciousness, and it is legitimate to suppose that a certain clairvoyant power is in some cases alone capable of determining the possibility of the spirit returning to reoccupy its mortal tenement. According to occult theory, if the cord or magnetic link that unites the astral with the physical body has not been definitely severed, it is still possible for life to be restored. What more probable than that one gifted with abnormal psychical powers, such as either Jesus or Apollonius, might diagnose the presence of this connecting link, which was invisible to all around? Eusebius argues that the stories told of Apollonius's psychic powers detract from his credit as a philosopher. Such powers, he argues, only appertain to a divine being, and therefore, while they may be justly credited in the case of Jesus, they must be dismissed in that of Apollonius. Such arguments will hardly appeal to the unbiased critic of the present day. We must recognize, however, that it was Philostratus's methods of embellishing his narrative with fantastic Oriental and other legends which gave a loophole for the attack of Eusebius. There was indeed a sufficiently serious sequel to this early passage of arms. The discussion as to whether or not Apollonius's miracles were entitled to be set in juxtaposition to those of the prophet of Nazareth proved in the end to be a veritable red herring drawn across the track of the whole story of Apollonius's life and labors. Though there is no recorded reference of Apollonius to Jesus or his teachings, he is made to appear in the light of subsequent controversies as the false prophet par excellence and worker of pseudo-miracles sent by the devil, according to one ingenious commentator, to destroy the work of the Saviour by an attempt to imitate his miracles and thus to disprove their unique character. When the printing press came into vogue and classical literature was widely disseminated by this means, Aldus hesitated to print the text of Philostratus's Life of Apollonius, and only did so finally with the text of Eusebius's treatise added as an appendix, so that, as he phrased it, the antidote might accompany the poison later on. Ingenious continental commentators advanced the theory that the life of Apollonius was a myth, and that it had for its object the defense of classical philosophy as opposed to Christianity. This theory is as ingenious as it is unconvincing, and even the authority of its defenders, Bauer and Zeller, has failed to secure it a serious hearing at the present day. It is obvious that the supposed antagonism between Jesus and Apollonius never really existed at all, and though probably they were born within 20 years of each other, there is no evidence to show that there was any connection of any kind between their respective lives and activities. Would you like me to continue with the next section, starting from the tradition which credits Apollonius with being a worker of miracles, in the same cleaned format? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, certainly, continuing seamlessly with all page numbers and footnotes removed, keeping the full narrative intact and unaltered in content or punctuation. The tradition which credits Apollonius with being a worker of miracles and magician is widespread, but there is comparatively little that is narrated of him by Philostratus, which is incredible, if assumed to have been performed by a man who had led a life such as that of the sage of Tyana, and who was gifted with such psychic powers as we are familiar with at the present day. We shall probably be right in regarding most of these narratives of psychic incidents as taken direct from the tablets of Damis, and therefore in the main authentic, even if the details are not in every case exact. A few instances will serve to illustrate the point of what I have said. After Apollonius's visit to Athens, in which he was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, he took ship for Egypt, stopping at Rhodes on the way. Arriving at Alexandria, he found that his reputation had preceded him and was met everywhere with reverence and respect. He took advantage of the friendly popular feeling towards him to intervene in a case of miscarriage of justice. A robbery had recently taken place in the town, and 12 men had been condemned in connection with it. An innocent victim of the general sentence was revealed psychically to Apollonius. He thereupon called the procession to a halt as they were being led to execution, and instructed the guard to place the innocent man last of the 12. The delay thus secured gave time for a horseman to ride up with a reprieve for the man in question, whose innocence had been established subsequently to the trial. It is not difficult to attribute such a case as this to psychic powers, but on the other hand, it is quite open to us to assume that Apollonius had learned something by normal means as to the doubt hanging over the condemned man's implication in the crime. Never, perhaps, has any possessor of noted psychic powers enjoyed the friendship or the hostility of so many great emperors as did Apollonius. Vespasian and Titus were both intimate in their friendship and sought the advice of the sage of Tyana on various notable occasions. It was, it appears, during this same visit to Alexandria that Vespasian arrived at the great Egyptian seaport and requested an interview with the sage. Vespasian explained to him his schemes, for he was already then aiming at the supreme power. Apollonius encouraged him and, to his great surprise, informed him that it was his destiny to rebuild the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus at Rome. As a matter of fact, the temple had just been burned down, but the news did not reach Egypt till some time later. What we call nowadays a telepathic wave had conveyed the incident to the knowledge of the seer. A similar instance of Apollonius's telepathic powers is narrated in connection with the death of Domitian. Apollonius had previously been arrested by this emperor on the ridiculous charge of sacrificing an Arcadian boy, in order, apparently, to discover the prospects of the succession of Nerva to the empire. He was acquitted by the monster who was Nero's rival in cruelty, without Nero's artistic talents, to the great surprise of all his friends. The story is that he vanished mysteriously from the court. We may, however, I think, without hesitation, attribute this incident to Philostratus's love of the dramatic, especially as it seems clear that he had already been acquitted and that there was no apparent reason why he should not walk out as a free man like any ordinary mortal in similar circumstances. What strikes the dispassionate reader as really remarkable is the fact that though Apollonius was twice arrested, once by Nero and again by Domitian, and though the philosophers of the day, being supposed to be hostile to the tyrants, met almost invariably with short shrift, the sage of Tyana was in each case acquitted and left the court, as we say today, without a stain on his character. Why, if the emperors had him arrested, knowing doubtless the value of the charges against him, did they not take steps to ensure his condemnation? The fact seems to be, without doubt, that they regarded him with fear. Whether this fear was due merely to his reputation as a worker of wonders, or to his actual psychic power exercised at their expense in the courts of justice, is an open question and clearly admits of two opinions. His own observations on this subject, as quoted by Philostratus, seem, however, to justify our accepting by preference the latter of the two views. Speaking to his friends about his intention to take ship for Rome in order to meet openly any charge that might be made against him, rather than to lie low in some distant corner of the empire, as his disciples were anxious that he should do, he observed that he would not consider a man a coward because he had disappeared out of dread of Nero, but would hail as a philosopher anyone who rose superior to such a fear. And he added, "Let not anyone think it foolish so to venture along a path which many philosophers are fleeing from. For in the first place, I do not esteem any human agency so formidable that a wise man can ever be terrified by it. And in the second place, I would not urge upon you the pursuit of bravery, unless it were attended with danger, after dwelling upon the ferocity and brutality of Nero, contrasting him with savage animals who could sometimes be tamed and mollified by coaxing and flattery. Whereas Nero was only roused to greater cruelty than before by those who stroked him, he continued in the following remarkable strain. If, however, anyone is disposed to dread Nero for these reasons, and is led abruptly to forsake philosophy, conceiving that it is not safe for him to thwart his evil temper, let him know that the quality of inspiring fear really belongs to those who are devoted to temperance and wisdom, because they are sure of divine succor. But let him snap his fingers at the threats of the proud and insolent, as he would at those of drunken men, for we regard these surely as daft and senseless, but not as formidable. We are accustomed to refer to Apollonius as a philosopher. While we are perfectly correct in so doing, it is well to observe what the term philosophy connotes when employed by the Tyanian sage. It is not obviously a question merely of adopting a creed or view of life or a certain set of philosophical opinions, but implies in the fullest measure the life led in accordance with these opinions and inspired by the courage with which the knowledge of their truth endows the man who professes them. The keynote, indeed, to the whole of Apollonius's life lies in the fact that his so-called philosophy was an active and inspiring force which dominated his whole conduct. I have alluded to the evidence of Apollonius's telepathic powers in connection with the death of Domitian. His passage of arms with this tyrant may have afforded the requisite psychic link. In any case, the Tyanian was made aware of Domitian's assassination under sufficiently dramatic circumstances. He had returned to Ionia after a stay of 2 years in Greece and was at the moment speaking at Ephesus. In the midst of his discourse, he seemed to lose the current of his words, and the audience noticed a troubled expression passing over his features. Suddenly breaking off any further attempt to continue his speech, he stepped forward 3 or 4 paces on the platform from which he was addressing the assembly, and cried out in loud tones, "Strike the tyrant! Strike!" The audience were naturally amazed at this sudden outburst, but soon, coming to himself, Apollonius explained to them that Domitian had been slain at that hour, and that a vision from the gods had been granted to him at the moment of what actually took place. News arrived in due course confirming his statement. This story is narrated by Dion Cassius as well as by Philostratus. Beyond these records, there are several others of a sufficiently startling character, which it is not easy to take too literally. There is, for instance, the narrative of the rescue of a young Athenian from the clutches of a vampire. The youth, according to the story, mistook the vampire for a normal living woman, and being infatuated with her, was on the point of marrying her until Apollonius dispelled the illusion. Probably this was one of the many romances that had collected round the name of Apollonius between his death and the time of Philostratus, though there may possibly have been some small grain of truth at the bottom of it. Another story, which may have had some basis in fact, has been so embroidered upon as to render it quite incredible in the form in which it is presented by the biographer. This relates to the supposed interview of Apollonius with the ghost of Achilles, which was held to haunt the tomb of the Grecian hero. The reputation of Apollonius was so great, and his supposed power as a worker of miracles had obtained so widespread a currency by the 2nd century of our era, that all sorts of miraculous happenings were readily credited by the ignorant public when ascribed to the Tyanian sage. Philostratus appears to have made use of certain of these floating stories. That the name of Apollonius was regarded with the greatest veneration during the centuries following his death is abundantly evident. Caracalla honored his memory with a chapel or monument. Alexander Severus placed his statue in his lararium along with those of Christ, Abraham, and Orpheus. Aurelius is stated to have vowed a temple to the sage of Tyana, of whom he had seen a vision. Vopiscus, at the end of the 3rd century, speaks of him as a sage of the most widespread renown and authority, an ancient philosopher and a true friend of the gods. He it was, says Vopiscus, who gave life to the dead. He it was who did and said so many things beyond the power of men. In the work entitled Quaestiones et Responsiones ad Orthodoxos, attributed, though apparently in error, to Justin Martyr, occurs among other of these questions the following. If God is the maker and master of creation, how do the telesmata of Apollonius have power in the orders of that creation? For as we see, they check the fury of the waves and the power of the winds, and the inroads of vermin and attacks of wild beasts. These telesmata, or talismans, were articles that had been, or were supposed to have been, consecrated or magnetized with some religious ceremony by Apollonius. Would you like me to continue with the next section? We see then that around the name of this philosopher gathered, in the same cleaned format, you said, continue. ChatGPT said, of course, here is the next portion, continuing seamlessly with all page numbers and footnotes removed, preserving the text exactly otherwise. We see then that around the name of this philosopher gathered as time went on a mass of more or less incredible miraculous tradition. And, as happens too often in such cases, the real work of this great religious reformer was lost sight of amid this accumulation of legend that impressed the popular eye, which was too dull to appreciate or understand the deeper significance of the life work and esoteric teaching of the sage. Orthodox religion in the Roman Empire had indeed at this time fallen into very much the same sort of discredit as Orthodox Christianity has among ourselves today. Two definite attempts were made to resuscitate these old religions of Greece and Rome by reviving the understanding of the essential spiritual truths which they enshrined. The first by Apollonius of Tyana, who was above all else a reformer of the ancient Greek religion from within, and the other, an abortive one 300 years later, by Julian the so-called apostate. These classical faiths were, however, too much overlaid with mythological stories of an unedifying character ever again to recover their ascendancy over the popular imagination, and the ascetic life and esoteric interpretation which appealed to the isolated religious communities which Apollonius visited in his extensive travels throughout the countries bordering the Mediterranean and as far east as Persia and India, could not in their very nature make a popular appeal to the average man. We see now that the triumph of Christianity was due to the universality of its appeal, and that however uncertain the issue of the struggle of the contending faiths appeared at the time, that issue was never really in doubt. The ascetic philosopher worked for the little public to whom the life of self-denial and esoteric truth are all in all, and to whom the world and the pursuits of the ordinary citizen take a place of minor importance. The friend of publicans and sinners, who was in all things tempted like as we are, was able to draw all men unto him by a compelling force, such as the austere discipline and profound philosophy of Apollonius could never command. Jesus of Nazareth, in short, triumphed, and there is a profound significance in this fact, because mankind, in the realization of his true humanity, forgot that he was accounted a god. The life of Apollonius was so far removed from anything the average man could comprehend that the world lost sight of the wisdom and deep spirituality of his teaching, in amazement at a worker of miracles so far beyond human ken that he came to be reckoned even a manifestation of deity. We are not, however, justified in supposing that it was primarily to his miracle-working powers that Apollonius owed his reputation among his contemporaries. It was rather as the wise man who had more knowledge and experience of the world than those around him, whose judgment was sounder and more unbiased by personal considerations than other men's, and whose high spirituality kept him aloof from all considerations of private gain or private interest, that Apollonius was regarded by the men of his own day. Later tradition, which invested him with all kinds of miraculous achievements, served to dim the halo round a great name. The foremost men of his time in thought and action, the emperors Vespasian, Titus, and many others, did not come to consult Apollonius because he was some master magician. We do not, in effect, ask advice of a man in our hour of need because he can do the vanishing trick in a court of law, or pull rabbits out of his hat when there are no rabbits to pull, or do any of the marvelous performances which strike the vulgar with amazement. We seek rather the advice of one whose judgment is saner and whose knowledge of the world is greater than that of his fellows. It was for this reason that the wisest of the Roman emperors came to consult Apollonius by preference with regard to the great task with which they were entrusted when they had all the highest intellects in the Roman Empire from which to choose. The account of Titus's first meeting with the Tyanian sage is of some interest, and not without its humorous side. Apollonius, who was already acquainted with his father, sent greetings to Titus after the suppression of the Jewish insurrection, saying in characteristic manner, "Whereas you have refused to be proclaimed for success in war and for shedding the blood of your enemies, I myself assign to you the crown of temperance and moderation because you thoroughly understand what deeds really merit a crown." Titus thoroughly appreciated the compliment and was not to be outdone by the other's courtesy. "On my own behalf," he replied, "I thank you no less than on behalf of my father, and I will not forget your kindness. For although I have captured Jerusalem, you have captured me." After Titus had been appointed to share his father's responsibilities in the government of the empire, he did not forget Apollonius, and when he was in Tarsus wrote to the sage begging him to come and see him. When he had arrived, Titus embraced him, saying, "My father has told me by letter everything in respect of which he consulted you, and lo, here is his letter, in which you are described as his benefactor and the being to whom we owe all that we are. Now, though I am only just 30 years of age, I am held worthy of the same privileges to which my father only attained at the age of 60. I am called to the throne to rule, perhaps before I have learnt myself to obey, and I therefore dread lest I am undertaking a task beyond my powers." Thereupon Apollonius, after stroking his neck, said, for he had as stout a neck as any athlete in training, "And who will force so sturdy a bull neck as yours under the yoke?" "He that from my youth up reared me as a calf," answered Titus, meaning his own father, and implying that he could only be controlled by the latter, who had accustomed him from childhood to obey himself. "I am delighted then," said Apollonius, "in the first place to see you prepared to subordinate yourself to your father, whom without being his natural children so many are delighted to obey, and next to see you rendering to his court homage in which others will associate yourself. When youth and age are paired in authority, is there any lyre or any flute that will produce so sweet a harmony and so nicely blended? For the qualities of old age will be associated with those of youth, with the result that old age will gain in strength and youth in discipline. The records of Apollonius's pithy sayings are very numerous and give a better insight into the man's character than the startling achievements with which he is so commonly credited. Once, when staying at Smyrna, he complimented the inhabitants on their zeal for letters and philosophy and their numerous activities, urging them to take pride rather in themselves than in the beauty of their city, for, although they had the most beautiful of cities under the sun, and although they had a friendly sea at their doors, nevertheless it was more pleasing for the city to be crowned with men than with porticos and pictures, or even with gold in excess of what they needed, for, he said, public edifices remain where they are and are nowhere seen except in that particular part of the earth where they exist. But good men are conspicuous everywhere and everywhere talked about, and so they can magnify the city the more to which they belong in proportion to the numbers in which they are able to visit any part of the earth. And again, when visiting the monument to Leonidas, the hero of Thermopylae, he was enthusiastic in admiration for the Greek leader. And on coming to the mound where the Lacedaemonians were said to have been overwhelmed by the arrows which the enemy rained upon them, he heard his companions discussing with one another which was the loftiest peak in Hellas, the topic being suggested, apparently, by the sight of Mount Oeta, which rose before their eyes. Accordingly, ascending the mound, he said, "I consider this the loftiest of all, for those who fell here in defense of freedom raised it to a level with Oeta and carried it to a height surpassing many mountains like Olympus." On another occasion when, on arriving at Athens and meeting with an enthusiastic reception at the hands of the people, he proposed to be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, the Hierophant showed jealousy of Apollonius's great reputation, which he felt put his own into the shade, and was reluctant accordingly to admit so formidable a rival. He therefore made the excuse that Apollonius was a wizard and had dabbled in impure rites, and that he could not in consequence consent to initiate him. Apollonius, however, was fully equal to the occasion, and retorted, "You have not yet mentioned the chief head of my offending, which is that knowing as I do more about the initiatory rite than you do yourself, I have nevertheless come for initiation to you as if you were wiser than I am." The attitude of the crowd was so hostile to the Hierophant on discovering his rejection of their honored guest that he found it advisable to change his tone. But Apollonius preferred to postpone his initiation till a later occasion, and, it is said, foretold the name of the successor who was destined to initiate him 4 years after. Would you like me to continue with the next portion, beginning from "Of many men who have led a deeply spiritual life"? You said, continue. ChatGPT said, "Of many men who have led a deeply spiritual life and sacrificed everything for the sake of the pursuit of a spiritual ideal, it is recorded that they were wild and profligate in youth. Such was the case with Saint Francis of Assisi, and Apollonius's contemporary, the zealous Saul of Tarsus, led a changed life from the moment of his conversion. Indeed, it has been said, referring doubtless to such instances, that the greater the sinner, the greater the saint. This saying, however, is by no means applicable to Apollonius. From his earliest days, his choice was made clear. He came of a family which was at once wealthy and well-connected, and in addition to this, he was endowed by nature with exceptional abilities and a remarkable memory, while the beauty of his person excited universal admiration. Every temptation, therefore, which fortune could offer, might, one would have thought, have led him to choose the path of worldly success. From the age of 14, however, he abandoned all idea of the pursuit of pleasure and devoted himself to discovering among the numerous Greek philosophies of the day some school of thought which would enable him to live up to his own ideals. Finally, he adopted the system of Pythagoras, but was not content to receive it in the sense of accepting its doctrines and not living the life, after the manner of his teacher, Euxenus. Accordingly, when Euxenus asked him how he would begin his new mode of life, he replied, "As doctors purge their patients." Hence, says G.R.S. Mead in his biography, he refused to touch anything that had animal life in it on the ground that it densified the mind and rendered it impure. He considered that the only pure form of food was what the earth produced, fruits and vegetables. He also abstained from wine, for though it was made from fruit, it rendered turbid the ether in the soul and destroyed the composure of the mind. In addition to this, he went barefoot, let his hair grow long, and wore nothing but linen. On the death of his father, when he was 20 years of age, he inherited a considerable fortune, which was left to him to share with his elder brother, a dissolute young man of 23. When his brother had run through his share of the patrimony, he endeavored, successfully as it appears, to rescue him from his vicious life, and made over to him half his own share of the inheritance. Having distributed the major part of the remainder among his relatives, he merely retained for himself a bare pittance. Before starting on his missionary activities, he was probably by far the greatest traveler of his time. He took the vow of silence for 5 years. After this, he traveled from place to place, making the acquaintance of temple priests and heads of the religious communities, endeavoring always to bring back the public cults to the purity of their ancient traditions, and to suggest improvements in the practices of the private brotherhoods, the most important part of his work being devoted to those who were followers of the inner life. Public instruction in ethics and practical life he never gave until after the middle of the day, for, he said, those who live the inner life should on day's dawning enter the presence of the gods, spending the time till midday in giving and receiving instructions in holy things. His Indian expedition, from which his friends and disciples endeavored to dissuade him, he undertook, as he stated, on the advice of his inner monitor, starting his perilous undertaking entirely alone, and so continuing until he made the acquaintance of Damis at Nineveh. There is some doubt as to the date of Apollonius's birth, but an allusion by Philostratus makes it appear that he was quite a young man at the time of his Indian expedition, and as he apparently did not commence his 5 years' vow of silence till after he came of age, we must assume that he was somewhere between 26 and 30 at the commencement of this undertaking. Treadwell dates the Indian travels as from 41 to 54 AD. If this is approximately accurate, we may assign his birth date to the second decade of the first century of the Christian era. Assuming this to be the case, he was presumably over 80 years old at the time of his death, which occurred about 98 AD. Damis had been his almost inseparable companion from the time when he first met him at Nineveh. It seems to have been a case of something akin to love at first sight, for the Assyrian was seized at once with an enthusiasm for the nobility of Apollonius's character, which was blent with a natural and even dog-like affection. At the last, however, his companion was not with him, and there is some mystery as to the exact place and occasion of his death. He sent Damis away when the expected time approached, on the pretext of entrusting him with a confidential letter to the Emperor Nerva, so that it may be said of him, as it was of Moses, "No man knoweth his burial place unto this day." Apollonius had never reason to regret his Indian travels. He became deeply imbued with the metaphysical ideas of the Brahmins, and was in the habit ever after of extolling their spiritual philosophy as the fountainhead of all the profounder truths of Western religion. As to Damis's record of Apollonius's sojourn with the Indian philosophers, we have only Philostratus's garbled account to guide us, and the quotation of Apollonius's cryptic observation, "I saw men dwelling on the earth and yet not on it, defended on all sides without any defense, and yet possessed of nothing but what all possessed." It may be well to quote the interpretation of this saying given by Mr. Mead. "They were on the earth, but not of the earth, for their minds were set on things above. They were protected by their innate spiritual power, of which we have so many instances in Indian literature. And yet they possess nothing but what all men possess, if they would but develop the spiritual part of their being." There are a good many references in the conversations with Apollonius to the belief in reincarnation, which was of course an essential tenet of Pythagorean philosophy. And he himself averred that in his previous life he was a man of no consequence, to wit, a ship's pilot. A letter ascribed to him, whether rightly or wrongly, has some interesting observations on this subject. Why has this false notion, he asks, of birth and death, i.e., that they are real and not illusory in character, why has this false notion remained so long without being refuted? Some think that what has happened through them they have themselves brought about. They are ignorant that the individual is brought to birth through parents, not by parents. Just as a thing produced through the earth is not produced from it, the change which comes to the individual is nothing that is caused by his visible surroundings, but rather a change in the one thing which is in every man. The portrait of Apollonius, which has been handed down through many generations, has become blurred and disfigured beyond recognition, and it seemed therefore well to give, even if in but a brief outline, such a sketch as might convey a juster idea of the philosopher whose friendship the greatest men of his day considered it their highest honor to enjoy, the man who chose the path of sanctity at a time of life when others choose the primrose path of dalliance, who chose wisdom for her own sake and truth for the sake of truth. The world holds no record of a long life lived more nobly, of a more undaunted courage in confronting the tyrant, of a more unflinching tenacity of purpose, of a more single-minded devotion to a high ideal. His boyhood's choice, the inspiration of his manhood, the beacon light of his latest years, to follow in the footsteps of that form, so austere in the simplicity of her loveliness, whose ways are ways of pleasantness and all whose paths are peace.